Hey y'all, it's entry number 56 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on James Conner, running back, Arizona Cardinals. We'll start with the positives with James Conner's fantasy profile. He's been a strong fantasy running back in the past. James Conner has been an RB1 in 2 of the last 4 years, 2018 and 2021. In 2018, he finished as the RB7 in standard, with 225.0 total fantasy points and 17.3 fantasy points per game. The RB6 in half PPR formats with 252.5 total fantasy points and 19.4 fantasy points per game, and the RB6 in full PPR formats with 280 total fantasy points and 21.5 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In 2021, James Conner finished as the RB5 in standard with 220.7 total fantasy points and 14.7 fantasy points per game, the RB5 in half PPR formats with 239.2 total fantasy points and 15.9 fantasy points per game, and the RB5 in full PPR formats with 257.7 total fantasy points and 17.2 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Having 2 high-end fantasy seasons already under his belt makes it easier to see what Conner is capable of in fantasy. The next thing I really like about James Conner's fantasy profile is his dual threat capabilities. In each of the last 4 seasons, James Conner has seen at least 116 carries and caught at least 34 passes. Having this ability to be effective both on the ground and through the air makes Conner less likely to be taken off the field for different game scripts. The last thing I really like about James Conner's fantasy profile is that Chase Edmonds is gone. The Arizona Cardinals saw Chase Edmonds leave via free agency this past offseason as he joined the Miami Dolphins. Edmonds was one of the key parts of the Arizona Cardinals running back committee last year, as he had 116 carries, 592 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 43 receptions, 53 targets, and 311 receiving yards. With Edmonds gone, Conner could see his workload increase in 2022, particularly in the passing game. Moving on to some of the concerns with James Conner's fantasy profile. Likely touchdown regression. James Conner scored 18 touchdowns last year, 15 rushing and 3 receiving. While he was one of the more utilized backs in the red zone, inside the 20 he had 41 carries, inside the 10 he had 28 carries, and inside the 5 he had 16 carries according to Pro Football Reference. Statistically, he was a little lucky as he was 3rd among all backs in fantasy points scored inside the red zone despite actually ranking 9th in actual opportunity according to Sharp Football Analysis. He should still be above average in this area, but it's likely that we see his touchdowns drop from his 2021 numbers. The next major concern I have with James Conner's fantasy profile is that he's injury prone. James Conner has struggled with injuries throughout his career and has played in 65 of a possible 81 regular season games in his NFL career. The 15 games that he played during the 2021 season was actually the most games that he's played in a single season during his 5-year career. His injury history is pretty extensive. At the NFL level, it includes multiple shoulder AC joint sprains, multiple quad strains, multiple ankle sprains, turf toe, lower back lumbar sprain, heel bruise, and a chest rib sprain, according to Draft Sharks, and he's listed as high risk for injury in 2022. The last concern I have with James Conner's fantasy profile is that Darrell Williams is brought into the mix. Yes, we highlighted that Chase Edmonds is gone, but the Cardinals may have brought in his direct replacement in Darrell Williams. Williams put up a stat line of 144 carries, 558 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, 47 receptions on 57 targets for 452 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns last year for the Chiefs. And there's a strong possibility that he slides directly into the Cardinals' primary pass-catching back role in 2022. In addition, Darrell Williams was solid in the red zone himself last year with 14 carries inside the 5, tied for the third most, and it resulted in 6 rushing touchdowns. And he could be more of a threat to James Conner's red zone touches than Chase Edmonds was. Some additional thoughts on James Conner's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, in 0.5 PPR formats, James Conner had 1 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 15 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, 1 out of 15 games with 25 to 30 fantasy points, and 1 out of 15 games with over 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Breaking tackles. James Conner broke 17.3% of his tackles and had 68.4% of his yards after contact in 2021, which was above average for a running back according to RotoWire. The Arizona Cardinals offense ranked 8th in total yards with 373.6 per game, and 11th in points per game with 26.4 per game in the 2021 season according to ESPN. The Arizona Cardinals head coach Cliff Kingsbury has trended more towards a bell cow approach on the ground. The Arizona Cardinals offensive line ranked 15th at the end of last year according to Pro Football Focus's rankings. In 2022, they are slated to have 4 of the 5 same starters from the 2021 season, but the average age of the starting offensive line will be over 30 come week 1, which may be something to watch. Personal opinion. James Conner is currently going off the board as RB12, about pick 25 overall on ESPN, and RB15, about pick 31 overall on Yahoo. This feels on the higher side to me. When he's healthy, he'll have his role on the ground and be the team's goal line back, but I don't see him upping his pass-catching work too much this year as the team picked up Darrell Williams, and Cliff Kingsbury has seemed to prefer utilizing 2 different backs for different roles, the goal line role and the between the tackles guy and the pass catcher, and it's likely that his touchdowns dip from the 18 that he had last year. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. James Conner's My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for the UPMC Hillman Cancer Center. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.